So App.JS is one of a number of HTML frameworks out there. In the previous version of the Complete Web Developer course, I actually used jQuery Mobile, and you're very welcome to check that out as well. The main reason I've switched to App.JS is because jQuery Mobile hasn't been updated substantially, and the apps that you build with it simply don't work as well as I'd like, and they don't look that great either. So App.JS is very simple, it's good looking, and it's easy to get started with as well. So on that note, let's click download, and that will download App.JS version 2 to our desktop. And then we'll open that up, and I'm actually going to copy that, and then we'll create a new folder within the Complete Web Developer course. So, new folder, and I'll of course call this 9 mobile apps. And then we'll place our App.JS in there. And you can see we've got the CSS, the JavaScript, a file called Zepto.js, which I'll tell you about in a minute, and then index.html. So let's open up index.html in Chrome and see what it looks like. It's not a great deal to look at, but we've got our homepage bar at the top, and then we can click on page 2, which takes us to page 2, and very nicely that automatically gives us a back button at the top there to take us back to homepage. That's one of the many features of App.JS which make it a huge time saver compared to coding your own mobile app. So to investigate how App.JS works, we're going to start by looking through the code of the homepage, and then we're going to try and recreate this demo app on the App.JS homepage to get a bit more detail as to how it all fits together. It's worth saying that, as usual, we're not trying to become App.JS experts here. We're learning how to get to grips with a new framework quickly to allow us to get on with our development projects as quickly as possible. So let's go back over to the Finder and open index.html in brackets. So here's the code. It's very familiar. We've got our usual HTML header with a title, viewport, and style sheet, and got an empty set of styles there. So nothing new there. And then we've got our app page with a data page attribute of home. If we look further down here, we've got a data page attribute of page 2. So what we've actually got going on here is that each page of the app is its own div. So we don't have multiple HTML files here, we've just got a single HTML file with each page of the app having its own app page div. And then within that, we've got the app top bar, the app title, and then app content, app section, and the only thing that we had here was a button saying go to page 2. And page 2 is very similar, although we do have this app button left class with a data back, data auto title pair of attributes. As you might imagine, essentially creates the back button for us. But then the content is pretty minimal. So that's all fairly clear so far. Now we come to this Zepto.js. Let's have a quick look at what Zepto is. It's essentially a small version of jQuery. So we'll use all the same commands as we do in jQuery, but it's a much smaller file size, and everything in theory is a lot faster than with jQuery. So it's ideal for working with mobile devices. If you do find that there are some jQuery functions that you need that are not covered with Zepto, then that's fine. You can just remove Zepto here and replace it with jQuery. But when you're working on mobile, it will almost certainly have all the functions that you need. So it's probably worth going with something like Zepto rather than the full jQuery. Then we've got our App.JS JavaScript code. And finally down here, we've got a bit of custom JavaScript. And it looks to me like this function will be called when the home page is loaded. So let's test out that theory just by putting an alert in there. Yep, we get that pop up when the home page is loaded. So that's what's going on there. And presumably this does the same thing but for page 2. Let's just check. There we go. Fantastic. And then we've got app restore. Let's just comment out app restore and see what happens. Right. So it seems to me that app restore is loading the whole page and applying all of the App.JS styles and JavaScript functions to it. So without that, we wouldn't have anything. And this try and catch setup is JavaScript code for essentially saying, try to do this, and if you have any problems, then just load the home page. And that's actually pretty standard terminology and works exactly the same in, say, Swift and Java as well. So I think the basic setup looks pretty clear. So let's go back and check out the demo and see if we can recreate it and in the process learn a bit about how we could make our own App.JS app. Now this demo is actually in an iframe here, so we can use Control-click and then view frame source to view the HTML source of that iframe. So let's try and recreate what's going on here bit by bit. So we've got some styles at the top. We might use some of those at some point, but I'm more interested in the look of the app at this point. So you can see we've got our title as before, and here we've got a paragraph of app section. So let's try putting that into our app. We've actually got a div with a class of app section there, but let's pop this in before that div and see how it looks. Okay, so we can actually make this a bit narrower so it looks a bit more like a phone screen. So that just gives us a nice separated section with nice rounded corners and everything else. So let's try and recreate these color boxes here. So we've got another class of app section, and it looks like it's got the colors built in. So let's have a look. Aha. So we're definitely going to need some custom styles to apply those. That's likely what's going on at the top here. So we've got some styles for the scroll page. We'll look at that a bit later on. Some backgrounds for the WebKit keyframes. They are the animations for when new pages are fading in or out. So we've got the background colors for those. And then we've got our specific styles for our color picker. So let's use those in our style section as well. And let's take a look. Wonderful. So now we've got these nice clean color sections, but of course they don't change the top bar background yet. So there must be some JavaScript which does that. Let's have a look down. And here we go. Now there's quite a lot going on here, including a bit of local storage, which we'll be talking about in the next video. So instead of just copying and pasting this code, we're going to attempt to recreate what the demo is doing with our own code. So essentially what we want is for when one of these is clicked on, it updates the top bar there to have that background color. Shouldn't be too tricky, right? Well, first of all, let's think where we would want to run that code. We'd want to run it both when the home page is launched and when page 2 is launched as well. So I'm going to set up a function. I'll use their function name, set up page color. I do like that they're spelling color with a U, always nice. And we'll have a page variable that's going to be passed to that function as well. And that will allow us to run that function from both of those pages without having to include the code twice. Okay, just to make sure everything's connected up right, let's do a quick alert. There we go. Hi, and on page 2, it does the same thing. Wonderful. So we're going to need our app to do two things. We're going to want to get the color of the background here, and then we want to set the color of the background to the same. If we look through the code here, it looks to me like this code would be very useful to us. So this looks through the page, it finds a UL with a class of color picker, and then it finds all the LIs, the list items, within that unordered list. It makes them clickable, and then when they're clicked, it runs a function that does something with old color that I'm not sure we're that interested in, but more relevantly, it gets the color of the clicked item from the data attribute, which you'll remember has a data color blue, data color dark blue, etc. So let's copy that part there. I'm happy to copy that bit of code because it's pretty familiar to us and we know how everything is working. What I don't want to do is just copy the massive chunk of code and not really understand it. So let's then just close our function code there. So let's create the variable color, and for now we'll just alert it. And that will just check to see if we've got the right color. There we go. So green, yellow, orange. Brilliant. So we've achieved the first part. Now let's update the title bar with that color. Again, let's have a look at the source code. It looks to me like removing classes and adding classes is going to be pretty important here. So let's add the class first. And it looks like the class that we're going to add is simply color. So let's take a look at the div that we'll want to update. So it looks like app top bar is what we want to be updating. So let's get rid of our alert and find app top bar. Oh, it's a class rather than an ID. And we want to add the class color to it. So let's just see if that works in itself. It may do. There we go. In fact, it almost does, but not quite. And the reason it doesn't work completely is because we're just adding lots and lots of classes on top of each other. So that's what this old color is doing there. It's removing the previous color that was added so that we can add the new color onto it. So let's set up our variable old color, which initially we'll have as empty, but then when we've updated the top bar to a particular color, we can remove the old color class. And to do that, we'll need to know what that was. So we'll set old color to color. And so first time round, say we click on the yellow, then we'll make the top bar yellow and we'll set the old color to yellow. And then we'll need to remove the old color class before we add the new one each time. There we go. And that should now remove the old class as well as adding the new one. So we should now be able to, oh dear, nope, that's gone horribly wrong. I suspect that's because initially it's trying to remove an empty class, which then removes what class it did have, which loses all the styling up there. So instead of just having an empty variable here, let's set it to an empty string, and then we can just use an if statement to check if old color is not an empty string, then remove that class. And that should get around that problem. We should now be able to update that. There we go, without any problems. Wonderful. Let's just add a couple of these items lower down then. I'll go for buttons and lists, and we'll actually be looking at inputs in a couple of videos time. So it looks to me like lists is a separate page with a big long chunk of code containing all those lists. Alright, so I'm going to use Command F and search for lists. Here we go, and that gives us this code here. So I'm going to copy that HTML because I think I understand it. While I'm here, I think I'll copy buttons as well. And that will give us 2 new pages. So we'll leave page 2 in there for the moment. But we've now got lists, which indeed looks pretty straightforward. It's what we're used to seeing. And then buttons as well. Looks like it should be pretty standard. So let's create our code to jump to the lists page. So I'm going to copy the code to jump to page 2. And then notice the lists page had a data page of lists. So we can just use lists there, and we want to set up the page color there as well. And the only other thing we'd need to add is the link to lists on the home page. So we should be able to find that if we search upwards for lists. And here we go. So here's our div with a class of app section, and it's got our links to lists, buttons, inputs, and scrolling. So let's put in that just below the top bar colors app section. There we go. Let's take a look at that. So that's looking good. Now if we click on lists, you can see it jumps very nicely to our list page. And notice that we didn't put a link in there. We didn't use an A with an href. We just used a class of app button and a data target of lists. And then the JavaScript within our framework interpreted that as a load of the lists page here. And that then does all the hard work of putting the back button and everything else. Great. So adding the buttons code should be straightforward. In fact, it might already work as it is. Yep, it does. Wonderful. So we can click those buttons and they behave very similarly to native buttons on iOS and Android. The one final thing I'm interested in here is this dialog, because dialogues are pretty useful to us in mobile applications. And that looks very iOS-like. So let's see how we recreate that. So again, we'll search for dialog. So it's got a class of app button and app menu. So let's search for app button. So there's a lot of them there. I wonder if there are any in the JavaScript. Nope. So let's have a look for app menu instead. Aha. So this looks interesting then. So we're searching through the page again, finding the app menu class, and then when it's clicked, we use the app dialog function, which opens up that dialog and displays it very, very similarly to iOS. And it looks like we have various buttons there, which we can then do something in response to in this function at the bottom. So I think I understand this well enough to copy that chunk of code. And this is going to be in the buttons page. So actually, before I copy it over, I'm going to add a controller for the buttons page. And then let's copy this over. So we want to copy from there to there, I think. And then paste that in, and then let's take a look. So now when we tap dialog, we get this lovely dialog, and we can cancel and take it back to where we were. Wonderful. So what we've got here is pretty basic, but it's fairly attractive. It would definitely serve as the basis of a iOS or Android app pretty well. Once you've got this far with a framework and you've been able to recreate one of the demos, it's probably worth having a look at the documentation and just having a fairly brief examination to see if there's anything that you missed or any other functions that you might find useful as you're building your apps. Things like event lists are very useful as well. And just clarifying how everything fits together is a very good use of the documentation. So if you're keen on making a mobile app, I definitely recommend reading through the docs of App.JS. We're going to move on though to something that's pretty important when you're building mobile apps, and that is being able to store data permanently within the app. That's not something we've looked at before, but we're going to see how to do it now with the HTML5 tool local storage.